and get that mechanical pencil ready. And then don't forget, as you're taking notes, you'll want to use or think about what you want to write down on those note cards to ask our panel tomorrow afternoon. Okay. Just as a roadmap, after Sean speaks, we'll give you one last chance to do some discussion time, bit of an extended discussion time, and then I'll give you instructions for tomorrow. All right. So your closing opening night speaker happens to be an associate professor at Biola. He is pretty smart, too. A double master's degree, a PhD. He happens to speak at schools and universities and colleges and camps and Christian youth summits like this in Bend, Oregon. And if you have not heard him before, you are in for an incredible hour in the next hour. Please welcome back to the Christian Youth Summit, Sean McDowell.
All right, I hope you are ready to rock and roll, because what Stephen said in the first session is that the root of our worldview is the character of God as revealed in the Scriptures. How do we know we can trust the Scriptures? Well, a number of years ago, I live in Southern California, and I was in line waiting to get a new version of one of the iPhones. I got there about 11 in the morning, didn't leave for 4 hours later with my phone. As I'm standing in line out of the store, it went down about 3 or 4 stores. It's about every 15 minutes or so, I'm taking a few steps. And these high school students come walking up to the guy right next to me. They said, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" He doesn't say a single word, turns around, leans on the railing behind him, and puts his back to these students. They're a little bit embarrassed. So they start to walk away. I stopped them. I said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" They said, "Well, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" I said, "I'm not even sure Jesus really existed. Do you actually believe that Christian stuff?" One of the students goes, "Of course I do. Jesus died on the cross for your sins," and he starts preaching the gospel. And I asked him a simple question. I said, "Why should I believe that story?" He holds up his Bible. He says, "Because it's right here in the Bible, the holy word of God." I said, "Why should I trust that book? How do you know that book is true?" He said, "Well, if you turn to this passage in 2 Timothy, it tells us that all Scripture is inspired." I said, "Okay, time out. If we want to know if we can trust that book, you can't turn to a passage within that book, assuming it's true to prove itself. We call that circular reasoning." He said, "Good point." I said, "Do you have any evidence outside of that book that proves the book itself is true?" He said, "Yes, don't you know we have these tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts that perfectly match up and tell us we have the Bible exactly as it was written down." I said, "Really? Do you know how many words are in the original Greek New Testament?" At this point, I know exactly what he was thinking. Why did I have to talk to this guy? He said, "I don't know." I said, "There's about 136,000 words. Now, if you take the different manuscripts and you compare them, there's between 300,000 and 400,000 differences across these manuscripts. That means for every word in the Bible, there could be 2 or 3 other words. Can you explain that to me?" He goes, "What do you think about evolution?" I said, "I'm glad you asked. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Don't you know humans and chimps share 99.72% DNA similarity? Haven't you seen the biogeographical distribution of species matches up with the fossil record?" And I'm going on. And he's backing up like this, and his eyes are getting bigger and bigger. I finally stopped. I said, "You know what? I got a confession to make. I'm a Christian." And I'll never forget the response. He goes, "Oh." But this girl right next to him, who did less of the talking, looked really bothered by this. She goes, "Was all that true?" I said, "Well, most of it was not true." I said, "Look, good for you guys. On a Saturday in Southern California, 10 minutes from the beach, being at the mall, sharing your faith with people, way to go. But if you're going to tell people they should bank their lives on an ancient book, don't you think you should have some good reasons we can actually trust that book is true? They agreed. They went on their way. About maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, I'm standing there. I feel a tap on the shoulder. I turn around. It's 3 new students who say, hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think? So I start launching into my charade until I stop, and I look over their shoulders. A little bit further back than the back of this room, I see the original students who set up their friends to convert the atheist. Exactly what some of you would have done, right? No, I love their boldness, I love their willingness, but let's be honest, if you were sitting there in that situation, how would you respond? Do you know why you trust not only the Bible as a whole, but the New Testament and really the Gospels? That's what we're going to focus on tonight in Pact to kick off our weekend. 1 Peter 3:15 says, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer for the hope within, and give it with gentleness and respect. So we're going to look at 3 simple tests. I call them 3 key tests. What's called the character test, you'll see coming up. And then after that is called the copy test. And then third is called the corroboration test. We're going to walk through these one by one. But first, I want to draw your attention to a book that my father first wrote in 1972. Now, some of your parents here or grandparents might recognize my father, Josh McDowell's name. He's written, thank you. He's written over 150 books. In fact, this fall he's celebrating 6 decades in ministry. Pretty amazing, faithful ministry. I'm going to tell a little bit more about his story tomorrow. But my father first wrote that book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He was a skeptic trying to disprove the Bible. At that time, there were no popular apologetic books. There was certainly no internet. So he traveled around the world trying to gather the evidence to show the Bible's false. To make a long story short, he became convinced that it's actually true. That's a recent update that we wrote a few years ago. Now it's about 700 pages in length, called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Well, when that book came out, I thought, you know what? I'm going to write an article in Fox News for my dad, of course, get him to approve it and make sure it expresses what he would want to say. And so I used a title that he had been saying when comparing that research. He said the evidence for Christianity is like a tsunami. So we published it in Fox News, and that week, that book launched into number 18 on all books on Amazon for the week. All books, not just Christian books. Now, why am I telling you this? Some reason today, there's a lot of people who will scoff. There's a lot of people who aren't open. But there are a lot of people who are open, like we heard Stephen share earlier, when presented with the evidence, to really follow where it leads. Our job is to be ready with an answer when people ask. That's what we're going to do. So let's start with what's called the character test. And this is really asking, were the documents put together with honesty? Do we have reason to believe we can trust the character of those who wrote it? Are they trustworthy? Well, if you actually look at what the different New Testament writers say, it's very clear that they're at least trying to convince us that they care about truth. So Luke, by the way, what was Luke's profession? He was a doctor, good, he was a physician. Have you ever noticed how Luke begins his gospel? He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were what? So Luke's not an eyewitness, but he's investigating those. And servants of the word, therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account so you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. You know what that is? This is a way in an ancient book of saying, I've done my homework and I'm doing my best to present truth to you. Luke sure seems to care about truth. What about Peter? Some people say, well, the Christian story is just a myth. Peter, who was an eyewitness, writes this. He says, we did not follow cleverly invented stories or myths when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were what? Okay, this is the participatory part of the program. But we were what? We were eyewitnesses of its majesty. So Luke investigated things. Peter was an eyewitness. Notice what John says when he writes his epistle. I want you to notice how many senses John points out. He says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we've looked at, what we've touched with our hands. How many senses does he appeal to? He appeals to 3. What we have heard, what we've looked at, what we have touched with our hands, we proclaim to you. Notice the gospel and New Testament writers aren't saying, somebody passed along the story to me. I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. They're like, we investigated. We were eyewitnesses. We saw, we touched, we heard. Now, oftentimes when stories are invented, how do they sound? How do they start? Once upon a time, or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, what's interesting about this is notice that language, a long time ago, once upon a time. When people are inventing stories, they often place them in different distant lands and different places that you can't investigate because it's fiction, it's made up. This is not what the gospel writers do. In fact, the gospel writers go out of the way to tell us exactly when and where and who is involved, where these stories took place. So Luke, for example, in Luke 3:1, notice what he says. Now in the 15th year, not the 14th year, not the 18th year, gives us the exact year, in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, not Julius Caesar, not Nero, not Augustus Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor, gives us his name and his position of Judea, gives us the region, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the reign of Iturea. Then he introduces the story of Jesus. Do you see what Luke is doing? This isn't a long time ago in a different galaxy or in a distant land or different place. Luke says, I'm going to tell you the people and the places and the times so you can check it out yourself if you want to. But then I think we can go even further. So remember, we're asking the question, can we trust these writers? They say we investigated, we saw, we touched, we heard. And then they tell us exactly where these stories take place. But then the documents also have something we call acts of embarrassment. So why would this matter? Look, a number of years ago, my sister left her computer open, and it was open to one of her social media accounts. And I felt the need to let the world know on my sister's behalf how incredibly wonderful her older brother is. The comments were actually funny. People are like, oh, this is so moving. I wish I had a brother like this. And I'm just laughing because I made it all up. Now, the moment my sister got there, she knew who did that, right? She wasn't like, oh, one of my other sisters did that. She knew it was me, obviously. Now, the reality is, when we make up stuff that's not true, what's human nature? We only do it to make ourselves look good or to get out of trouble, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I wonder what I can post on social media so everybody thinks I'm a complete loser. Now, you might do that to your friend, but that's a different story. Now, why does this matter? When historians look at ancient documents, and those documents include material that's embarrassing to the writer, then the historian goes, oh my goodness, this writer really cares about truth, that he or she is willing to report something that's disparaging to their character. This is someone I can trust. That's how it works. So have you ever just read through the Gospels and notice how many embarrassing things the Gospel writers include? You could probably think of some. For example, Peter denies Jesus multiple times. Jesus calls Peter Satan. Now, this is not a joke in case somebody's like, oh, they were having kind of a duel of insults, right, that sometimes friends do, right? Like my son for a while, he's older now, he's more mature. He used to like those your mama jokes. I'm like, buddy, when you say your mama, that's my mom, that's your grandma. He's like, I know, I don't mean that though. It's just, I'm like, okay. His favorite one was, he'd go, Dad, Your mom was so poor, ducks throw bread at her. I'm like, buddy, come on, man. Like, that's messed up, right? I'm with you. That's messed up. Now, the way these things work is sometimes people tell a joke and then try to get back at you and then try to get back. Like, that's what people are kind of doing, right? That is not what Jesus was doing with Peter. Peter's not like, oh, you got me, Jesus. That is completely not what happened here. This is the insult of insults to the leader of the apostles, by the way. Why would they make this up? Why invent that? How about another example of when the disciples, for example, fall asleep in Gethsemane? At the greatest moment of need, Jesus says, stay awake 3 times, and they fall asleep. How about sometimes the disciples don't even understand the teaching of Jesus? They don't get it. And finally, the women discovering the empty tomb. Now, in all 4 Gospels, women discovered the empty tomb. Now, maybe you've heard that but not thought about why. Well, that matters because in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered as significant as a man's testimony. And so if they were inventing a story, who's the least likely eyewitnesses they would have invented? The women. And yet all Gospels report the women because that's exactly what they believed happened. What's the point? Look, we're asking, can we trust the character of these writers? They say we investigated, we saw, we touched, we heard. We're eyewitnesses. They tell us who, when, where exactly so we can research it. They include embarrassing material because they care about truth. But then finally, what did it cost the believers to publicly proclaim Jesus? Well, according to church tradition, Peter was crucified, Andrew was crucified, Philip crucified, Bartholomew flayed to death, James the Greater beheaded, Matthew killed with the sword, Matthias stoned to death, and by the way, that has nothing to do with smoking weed. Thomas was stabbed with spear, John died after exile, Luke hanged, James was just stoned, beaten, Mark dragged, dead by horse, and Paul beheaded. Now, I actually did my doctoral dissertation on this 10 years ago, and on the plane here this morning, working on an update to this book, I've written a 350-page academic book researching those stories. And for some of these stories, it's hard to know when history ends and when legend begins. I think these 4 we know with a high level of confidence have actually died as martyrs. I think we can demonstrate historically those 4, maybe a couple more. But in some ways, we don't have to prove they all died as martyrs. You know what we know? In the beginning of Acts, what happens? The apostles say, we are witnesses of the risen Jesus. And they go out and they preach that Jesus is alive. And they're threatened, and they're beaten, and they're thrown in prison. Stephen is martyred. James is killed in Acts 12 too. And they won't stop preaching the risen Jesus. Why? Friends, you don't make up lies to put yourself in harm's way. The reason they preached that Jesus is risen is because they really believed he had conquered the grave and appeared to them. Today, talk is cheap. Talk is cheap. But when you put your life on the line for something you believe, you know what that tells me? You really, truly believe it. The apostles had the kind of character of people that we can trust. Now, a friend of mine, J. Warner Wallace, was an atheist for years, till he was 35 years old. And when he's 35 years old, they were having kids, so his wife said, let's go to church to give our kids morals. So he went to church. And he heard the gospel and thought, you know what? I'm going to investigate the gospel, starting with Mark. And he's a detective, by the way, a cold case forensic scientist. He's never lost a case in a court of law, for the record. He goes, I'm going to analyze the gospel of Mark and see if it's reliable testimony. To make a long story short, he became a Christian. He's a friend of mine, co-author of mine, phenomenal apologist. But what's interesting is he told me this one time. He said, Sean, people lie for one of 3 reasons: power, sex, or what? money. He goes, let's look at the apostles. Was it about power? They were following somebody who was crucified, who said, pick up your cross and follow me, and emphasized if you want to be first, you got to be last. Was it about power? Was it about sex or lust? Jesus was single. He had every opportunity, he had women followers, and he showed nothing but dignity and respect to women. Third, was it about money? No, they were at best middle class, probably less. And over again, they emphasized giving to the poor. Friends, we have every reason to believe that the gospel writers have the character to report what they think is true. Now, that's the first C. The second C is what we call the copy test. You say, okay, Sean, seems like these writers care about truth, but this book was written 2,000 years ago. How do we know it hasn't changed since it's been copied and copied and copied for 2,000 years? Good question. Well, to begin answering this, here's a way we would approach this. We look at two kind of sub-questions, so to speak. And here's the basic question. What's the time gap between an original copy and the copies we have today? Now, what do I mean by this? The Bible obviously was not like, written on a blog. It obviously wasn't written on a book. It's before the printing press. So they were copied by hand, either on a codice, an ancient book, or on a scroll. Well, that would fade. And then they'd have to copy the copies, etc. So one question we have is, when this was first written down, how much time has passed until copies we have today? And obviously, what do you think? We want longer time or less? Less. In general, the less copying time, then there's less room for intentional or unintentional errors. That makes sense. So like I mentioned, it would be copied and written down by hand. Actually, the Old Testament, at times, they would copy it literally letter by letter. When it got to the New Testament, they copy it, but then it would disintegrate. But then the question is, do we have the first generation? Do we have the second generation? The third generation? Which generation of the Bible do we have? Well, let me give you a little comparison before I answer this. This might help. Pliny the Elder was a Roman writer shortly after the time of Jesus. The earliest copy we have is from about 700 years after it was written. Josephus, a Jewish writer, the end of the first century, there's about an 800-year gap. Herodotus, a Greek writer from before the time of Christ, 1,500 years. Now, here's my question for you. Do you think most historians look at that and assume we can largely trust those writings? Yeah, they do, even with that time gap. Of course, the question is, what's the time gap from the New Testament? Here's some standard ancient books just to give you a little visual about how many books are removed from the time they were written. What's the time we have for the earliest portion of the New Testament? Within 10 to 100 years. Within 10 to 100 years. Now, you might say, 10 to 100 years, why can't you tell me exactly? Because old manuscripts didn't come with like dated stamps on them. There's no reason they would do that. And we have to kind of estimate through a range of different dating mechanisms. But from somewhere between 100 and 200 AD, we have this credit card-sized front and back portion of John chapter 18. Now, this is just one early example. As we move in time, we get more and more copies. But this is why Dan Wallace, who's kind of a modern-day Indiana Jones, so to speak, is one of the leading textual critics in the world. He said, we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you know an Alexander the Great skeptic? Anybody? Do any of you know any Julius Caesar doubters? By a show of hands. You don't. How many of you know a Jesus skeptic or a Jesus doubter? Why one and not the other? Well, on one hand, Jesus claimed to do some pretty radical things, didn't he? He claimed to be God, claimed that he was going to resurrect on the third day. So someone's going to make radical claims. We better back it up. But I think there's another reason too. When it's all said and done, it doesn't matter for our life and our eternal destiny what we believe about Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. But the single most important question ever asked in the history of the world is this question Jesus asked: who do you say that I am? How you answer that question has more implications for eternity than any other question you will ever answer. So I think there's a double standard with Jesus, because some people realize if I'm going to believe in Jesus, I got to completely change the way I live my life. That might be one reason why as well. So keep in mind, let me take a step back. We're asking the question, how do we know the Bible's been copied faithfully over time? One way, or the New Testament, is to look at how early the time gap is. And we have earlier and copies for the New Testament than other ancient books. The second question we want to ask is, how many manuscripts do we have? Now you tell me, do we want more or less? We want more. Now the more you have, the more differences you'll find across those manuscripts. But also when there's more, the greater ability we have to compare and contrast them and figure out what's actually in the original. So you're right, we want more. Well, give you a little comparison again. When it comes to Caesar, we have roughly 10 manuscripts. Plato's tetralogies, we actually have 7. When we updated, don't show the number yet, but when we updated Evidence Demands Verdict, we hired an expert to do the most careful analysis we could to find out the number of manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, for the New Testament. You know, we counted over 24,000. Over 24,000 copies. Now, these are all not complete manuscripts. Even a portion of one is considered a manuscript. But there are some complete manuscripts relatively early. Now, here's a chart, if you look at the next slide for me. This is just to give you a little visual of the number 1, the New Testament. The number 2 is the Iliad, which was kind of the ancient, version of the Bible to the ancient non-Christian world, so to speak. 1900. Sophocles, 193. Aristotle, 49. Down to Plato with 7. It's not even close with the New Testament. So if you took the average classical writer and you averaged it all out, there would be 20 copies. That'd be about 4 feet high. If we take the New Testament and stacked all those manuscripts together, do you know how high it would be? Over 1 mile high. Friends, wow is the appropriate response. What does that tell us? When you are comparing other ancient books that historians largely trust, it's like apples and oranges with the New Testament. The New Testament and the Gospels are truly in a category of their own. Now, who can tell me what the New Testament was originally written in? It was originally written in Greek. These manuscripts are in Syriac and Coptic and Latin, a whole bunch of different languages. But if we take Greek, there's probably about 5,300 Greek manuscripts that have been discovered. There's debate about a few. 5,300 manuscripts. Now, you'll recall when I started off this talk, I told you a story about encountering, role-playing an atheist, and encountering some students while getting my smartphone. And I said there's between 300,000 and 400,000 differences across these manuscripts. Well, this actually comes from a skeptic by the name of Bart Ehrman, he's a brilliant scholar. He actually works at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus that became a New York Times bestseller a number of years ago. And here's what he said. He said there are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now, if you let that sink in for a minute, that's a little bit unsettling, isn't it? There's more differences across our manuscripts than actual words in the New Testament. Now, what does that mean? Some friends of mine wrote this book called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. And they make a point that I think should be pretty obvious and helpful. They said most of these are inconsequential changes in orthography or word order. There's so many errors or variants to speak of across the textual edition because there's so many handmade copies. If you're going to have thousands upon thousands of copies, you're going to find this many differences. In fact, some scholars have said it's amazing we don't have tons more than we actually have. So how many do we have? A friend of mine named Peter Gurry, who's a very careful New Testament textual critic, he estimates there's roughly 500,000 non-spelling differences across Greek manuscripts. Now again, that's going to feel like a lot of differences. That's 500,000. What do we do with this? Well, let me just give you a couple examples of what these kind of differences entail. So, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. It's only 16 chapters. So one word that keeps showing up in the Gospel of Mark is immediately. It's like a fast-moving short gospel. Well, there's a theme in the Gospel of Mark. Each of the books of the Bible and the Gospels kind of have unique themes about them. And the theme of the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus is uniquely the Son of God. Now, this comes into full kind of fruition in 1529 when even the centurion on the cross says, "Surely Jesus is the Son of God." Well, that is like a drumbeat through the Gospel of Mark, repeating over and over again that Jesus is the Son of God. Well, if you look at how Mark starts in 1:1, it says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, we have different manuscripts, and some manuscripts have it say the Son of God right there, and some don't. So scholars are actually divided over whether or not the Gospel of Mark started by calling Jesus the Son of God, or a later scribe wrote it in as kind of a heading to tell everybody what the gospel is about. Do you see why that's a difference? As we uncover more manuscripts, eventually we'll probably narrow it down and know for sure. So let me ask you a question. What's at stake theologically with this difference? Nothing is exactly right. We know the Gospel of Mark teaches Jesus the Son of God. It says it. We just don't know if it's right there at the beginning or if that was added by a scribe. Does that make sense? So quite literally, nothing is at stake with the reliability of the text with this difference. I'll give you another example. I remember watching a debate. Don't throw it up there yet. I remember watching a debate with a friend of mine who's a Christian debating an atheist. And they were debating the Trinity. And it was at a university campus. And the atheist said, he goes, "Can you just give me one verse that proves the Trinity?" And my buddy was doing his best, but he floundered a little bit and changed the subject. And I remember watching that going, why do we have to give one verse? The idea of verses was kind of added later. It wasn't in the original. It's helpful. Why should we think a doctrine has to be captured in one verse? Nonetheless, there is a verse, if you'll throw it up there for me, 1 John 5:7, and here's what it says. There are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, which would be the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one. Does that sound like a good explanation of the Trinity? The only problem is it's probably not in the original. If you actually open up your Bible and look at it, sometimes it'll skip from John 5:6 to 1 John 5:8. Now, no one's making a big scandal about this. There should be a note in your Bible that explains. We don't know if this was in the original or if it was added later by somebody trying to say, here's one verse communicating the Trinity. We don't know for sure about that verse. In fact, most scholars would say it was added later. Now, let me ask you a question. Does this mean we should question whether God is a Trinity? Of course not. Does this mean we should question whether 1 John is actually an inspired, reliable book? Of course not. We just don't know about that verse. We don't know for sure. These are examples. See, I'm trying to help you understand that the Bible didn't just float down from heaven in the King James Version. I just lost some of you forever. That's not how it went down. In fact, it wasn't written in English or Middle English or Modern English, or there's actually a Gen Z Bible that just came out. Maybe some of you have seen this. I was reading it to my son, trying to have him explain it to me. I'm like, I don't get it. I'm a Gen Xer. Now, let me give you two examples. If you'll throw that next slide up there for me. The only disputed New Testament passages, more than 2 verses, are the last 12 verses in Mark and those verses in John 7:53. The last 12 verses in Mark, which is kind of Mark's version of the Great Commission, there are debates whether that was originally in Mark or added later. We don't know for sure the answer to that. By the way, that's the only place that deals with that you will handle snakes, by the way. And most scholars would say that probably wasn't in the original. That's a reality about Mark. Now, again, if you open up your Bibles and you look at it, and you have a decent Bible, there should be a little footnote, or it's in brackets telling you there's a little debate about this. There's no scandal going on here. Now, does anybody know what story is in John 7:53 through 8:11? The woman caught in adultery, that's right. The story of the woman caught in adultery, which is like a beloved story because Jesus shows such grace to her and he writes in the sand. That is not in any of the other Gospels, and it's not in our earliest manuscripts. We don't know for sure if it was left out, if it was added. Scholars don't know for sure about that story. That's a reality. I'm telling you the truth about this because it's very important to know that we have good reason to trust the vast majority of the Bible carefully preserved and kept, but there's a few instances that scholars are still trying to figure out. There's no secret here. There's no scandal, so to speak. Now, what follows from the fact that we don't know the end of Mark and that story in John? You know what follows? We don't know the end of Mark and that story in John. That's all that follows. In fact, I think we likely do know that the end of Mark ends before those verses at verse 8. I think it likely did end then. And scholars later added stuff because it felt so abrupt. This is why a friend of mine, a wonderful New Testament scholar, Craig Blomberg, said, "No orthodox doctrine or ethical practice of Christianity depends solely on any disputed wording. There are always undisputed passages one can consult that teach the same truths." In fact, what's interesting is, let me frame this for you. You might think the further we get away from the time of Jesus, the less confidence we have in the Bible because more time is removed. You know, it's the opposite. The further we get away, the more discoveries we make, the more technology we discover. Even things like artificial intelligence are now going to help us in fields like archaeology and textual criticism in some fashion or another to gain better confidence that we had in the past. So what have we looked at so far? We're looking at 3 C's. Number 1 is what C is number 1? The character. The writers say we investigated, we were careful, we saw, we touched, we heard. They tell us exactly where, when, and who, give embarrassing material, and they're willing to suffer and die for the belief they'd seen the risen Jesus. Seems to me they have the character to report truth. Well, how do we know it's been copied? We have more copies and earlier copies of the New Testament than we do any other ancient book that scholars routinely trust. The third C is what we call corroboration. Now we want to know, is there any evidence outside of this book that supports the claims inside of it? I'll give you a comparison and a contrast. If you compare the New Testament with, for example, the Book of Mormon, you are comparing apples and oranges. There is no compelling archaeological evidence at all that the Book of Mormon is true. There's none. I've looked into some of it. I'm not convinced at all. You look at the New Testament, story after story, place after place. We haven't found everything, of course not. But what we consistently find is telling and supporting the story of what the New Testament writers put down. Now, I want to give you just a couple examples of this that I think you might find interesting. For years, some skeptics would doubt that Pilate even existed. Some would say Pilate is not real, he didn't exist, because the only evidence was literary. Until this inscription was found. This is actually a replica that's in public. The real one is in a museum, but it's called the Pilate description or the Pilate inscription. And it actually reports Pontius Pilate under Tiberius Caesar in the exact time and place that we would expect this to be found. Friends, Pontius Pilate was a real historical person that matches up with the way the Bible describes him. He was. I'll give you another example. This is in the early chapters in John chapter 5. There's this report of this city called Bethesda, and there's this famous pool that's down there. You can kind of see it behind me. And as they dug down into this pool, it's described in John 5 as having 5 porticos that are like 5 colonnade structures. But for years, skeptics would write this off because they would say, this is not how archaeology was done. This can't be the case. Until they dug down in right behind me. Take a wild guess what they found. I'll tell you what they didn't find. I had a freshman doing a presentation on this. And she said, yes, they were digging in Bethesda and they found 5 porpoises. I was like, they didn't find dolphins. Exactly what I said. Like, porticos are like colonnade structures. They're not dolphins. They didn't find dolphins in Bethesda. As interesting as that would be. You're not supposed to laugh as a teacher, but I have to admit, I kind of laughed at that moment and then felt bad. I'm like, where did you get dolphins? Sorry. You fail for sure. No, I'm kidding. Look, you've heard it said there's no such thing as a stupid question. That's a lie. I'm just telling you. Now, they actually dug down in Bethesda and found the exact kind of colonnades and porticos that are described in John 5. One more example. This was quoted in the Harvard Theological Review years ago. Dr. Hewitt said there's astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. And at that time, he was right. Now, why does this matter? How do we know Jesus was pierced with nails? Remember, what does Thomas want to see? The nail marks in his hands and the spear wound in his side. But the crucified victims they found had not been crucified with nails. So it seems that the biblical account was misguided. Until in 1967, they found these remains of a dead man who's been dubbed Yehohanan, found in a tomb in Israel, in kind of the area of Judea, around the middle of the 1st century, and was crucified with nails. Exactly as described happened to Jesus. And what's interesting is his legs were possibly broken as described in John 19:32. Now, since that discovery in 67, they found multiple more crucified victims. In fact, about 2 years ago, if you were following in the news, they found another crucified victim around that time of the 1st century in Britain, which was still the Roman Empire, adding support to this is how the Romans would crucify. Friends, we haven't found everything in archaeology, and there's reason for this. There's politics are involved. Sometimes things are destroyed, built upon. But consistently what we find is that the archaeological record is confirming that the Bible got it right. Tomorrow you get to hear from a good friend of mine, Titus Kennedy, who has done some incredible work on Jericho. Now, he has been there and he has studied it and he has seen it with his own eyes. And he's going to walk through, he's an archaeologist on Jericho. So I'd invite you, definitely take a look at that. Take advantage of his resources. It's incredible. Another one, I just want to give you one more example I think is interesting from Babylon. A friend of mine, Joel Kramer, is an archaeologist in Jordan, is where he lives. And recently I had him on my YouTube channel, maybe about 2 months ago, because Babylon is in Iraq. And both Isaiah and Jeremiah have prophecies that specifically say Babylon will be destroyed. In that time, Babylon was the or one of the most powerful cities in the world. It said Babylon will be destroyed, never rebuilt, and owls and jackals will live in it. I interviewed my friend Joel Kramer, who went there. Take a wild guess what he found. When Saddam Hussein built his palace in Iraq, it was outside the city walls. The old walls still to this day have not been rebuilt. And he found actual footage of owls and jackals still living there. It's amazing. It's really incredible to find stuff like that. That's why my father and I, in the book Evidence Demands Verdict, say archaeology provides one important piece of evidence that helps confirm the New Testament record. Friend, the apostles has the character. They were willing to suffer and die for the belief they had seen the risen Jesus. The Bible's been copied carefully. We have earlier copies and more copies compared to ancient books that most people don't even question. And then we find corroboration for the Old Testament and the New Testament in archaeology, which tells me when we hold the Bible in our hands, we can trust it. Amen? Now, my guess is you might have more questions about this. I haven't even begun, well, I have begun, hopefully, we've been talking for 45 minutes, but I've begun to respond to many of the additional objections that come up, like what about supposed contradictions in the Bible? What about books that were left out of the Bible? You might have some questions about this. I would invite you to write those down because our last session tomorrow is going to be a Q&A section. So if you've heard questions come through TikTok, if you've seen them in a book or come from a friend or something you've wondered, make sure you submit those questions. And I want to do my best to help you answer those before we're finished. Now, if it's helpful to you, I mentioned the book Evidence Demands Verdict that is 700 pages long. I'm glad one person's excited. Now, just this year, a few months ago, my father and I released a book called, instead of Evidence Demands Verdict, it's called Evidence for Jesus. It's like, how long is this thing? It's like 200 shorter pages. It's like basically the Cliff Notes. You're welcome. Now, what it is, we got 25 of the toughest questions, and then they're like 4 to 5 page responses. So this is one chapter. How do we know Jesus is risen from the grave? How do we know Jesus is really God? Why is Jesus the only way? Friends, we are called to have answers for the hope within. And I hope not just my resources, but all the other resources in the back, take advantage of those. Because weekends like this come and go quickly, but if you start to equip yourself and you start to learn, it's amazing how this becomes a part of your character and starts to transform you from the inside out. So there's copies of Evidence for Jesus. A book I'm going to talk about tomorrow is a book called A Rebel's Manifesto. I wrote this for students, calling you to be a rebel, but of a different kind. And in part got the 25 thorniest issues that many of you are confronted with in your generation. Things like race, things like transgender. How do we think about these topics as Christians and live out and defend a Christian worldview? That's in a book called A Rebel's Manifesto that might be helpful. All right, Brian, I might turn it back to you. Am I sending them to small groups? I forgot to check the memo of where. Oh, there you are, right there. All right, awesome. Come on up here and transition us.